and welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision making as a parent of a demand avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. Why is PDA so difficult to understand for parents, pediatricians, therapists, teachers, and anyone looking at your life from the outside? Today, I'm going to be talking about questions that I've been getting. First, for people to understand whether or not the PDA frame and potentially working with me is a good next step. And I just want to help bring clarity to that so that people can understand the answers to these questions. So the question I left off on was, how do I know if my child is PDA or if it's just defiant or difficult behavior? And last week when I was talking about this, I started with an anecdote from when I used to work at a large nonprofit in Washington, D.C. And my colleagues would make fun of me because I had a saying that I would use at what were called methods reviews, because our team was in charge of research integrity for the organization. And it was also a policy and advocacy organization. So the policy people or advocates, their teams, would come to my team and we would review, is this objective, unbiased? Does it have research integrity? And there would be a methods review that I would run. And they would say, we think that putting a 500 square foot conservation area in the Indian Ocean would save X amount of fish that's endangered, right? And my response was always, it's an empirical question. So what does that mean? That's the thing that my colleagues and my friendlies would make fun of me for, it's an empirical question. We don't always know the answer until we start collecting data, right? And I really want to have you guys bring that mindset to not just the question of whether your child is PDA or whether they would benefit from a PDA framework, but also as you're experimenting with certain accommodations that I talk about here that you learn elsewhere, because even if it's the correct, quote, correct accommodation for a PDA child, it might not necessarily apply to your child, and we have to collect data. So it's an empirical question. And often when parents are trying to understand, is it Defiance or PDA or both, because many children have difficult behaviors just because they're kids, and kids are difficult sometimes, I always ask them to think about, well, what happens regarding your response, right? So often parents come to this page because they have used more traditional parenting approaches, even if they're gentle, that include boundaries and limits, and they see just this continual escalation no matter what they try and do, right? And additionally, I encourage parents to look at, how are things impacting basic needs, not just behavior, because often those two are viewed separately, like a child who's defiant, but also has IBS or gastrointestinal issues or constipation or encopresis, and they're viewed as this is a medical issue and this is bad behavior, but they're actually both linked potentially to the nervous system, right? Or, a child who has extremely challenging fight-flight behavior, but it looks like opposition, and they're also struggling with understanding verbal communication. It looks like they're just avoiding you, or, they're starting to stop eating to the point where you're noticing this and wanting to seek more support. So we have to look at this holistically to answer these questions. And if you see it's just always continually escalating or shutting down, hi everybody, that's a good clue that the root cause isn't motivated behavior or intentional attention-seeking behavior, which is how people often think of, quote, bad behavior. So I'm going to bring the same frame to the next question that I got, and it's one I get often. I have written about it a bit on the Instagram tiles, but how do I know it's not OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, ODD, ADHD or some other neurotype or disorder, right? And again, I'm going to bring to you that it's an empirical question, right? Like I can't just say like, these are the things that would make your kid ODD versus PDA, because on the surface, you might see the exact same behaviors, but the purpose of hopefully the work that we're doing here is trying to like more creatively understand the root cause. So, but there are a couple questions that I would ask a parent to reflect on and observe, right? So with the first category, OCD, which I just want to name, can be co-occurring with PDA. It doesn't mean they're mutually exclusive. Like if you have OCD, it's not PDA and vice versa. So often equalizing behavior, or the behavior that's controlling of a PDA or of their surroundings to get back to a place of safety, can look like OCD like behavior, where they're controlling things and needing things to be a certain way, or correcting the words you say, or where you can sit in the room, or where a sibling can play, or how they can play, etc. It can look very much like OCD. And actually, when my son was 3.5, that's what I thought was going on too. I was like, this looks like OCD behavior, right? And I had never even heard of PDA, but it also, there was something about it that didn't make sense in that frame, everybody, because it was fluctuating so much. And it wasn't as much towards objects, it was more towards me or other safe individuals, right? And it wasn't present with other people as much because of the masking. But a question I ask is like, does it appear that the behaviors that are controlling are more ruminative, more anxiety provoked, more thought based, where it's like, I have to do X thing before I feel safe? Or is it sort of reflexive and it's almost like they don't notice that they're doing it, but it might only come out with you as the parent, as a safe person? So those are questions to ask. Also understanding that like treatment or support for OCD is pretty much the opposite of how we support PDA kids. And with parents who have both those things going on, they have the responsibility, the very difficult responsibility, to discern, okay, how much am I going to help this child get through their sticky brain so they don't get stuck and it becomes a bigger fear, versus how much am I going to accommodate so that they're not pushed past their threshold of tolerance. So, I think what's important here are that there's two different approaches to support the child, and neither are wrong or right. They're just different root causes. So that's something to think about. Oppositional defiant disorder. Personally, I'm not a clinician, and so there's like a huge caveat with this, but I don't think this diagnosis is like, okay, when I was an academic, like when we had to define categories, they had to be mutually exclusive from other things and really be explanatory. And ODD for me, like when I look in the Diagnostic Statistical 5 manual and I look at how much the surface level behaviors that are described overlap with so many other things, it does not seem like an explanatory category or diagnosis. And so, I don't really believe in ODD. I think there's always a deeper root cause. And Mona Delahooke, who wrote Beyond Behaviors, also has this perspective. I think there are a lot of clinicians in the new paradigm of understanding the nervous system who also don't really believe in ODD. However, it is what exists as a diagnosis, and PDA doesn't. So a lot of kids who are PDA do get this diagnosis. And it doesn't mean as a parent that you've done anything wrong or that it wasn't a helpful exercise to like understand your child, right? But we have to think about what actually supports the root cause of the behaviors regardless of diagnosis. And with ODD, some of the suggestions are the opposite of what helps a PDA child, which is like, more strict parenting, more, routine, consequences, etc. So that's why it's an empirical question, because most of you are here because you've tried a bunch of other things and it didn't work, right? So if your child is diagnosed with ODD, you're probably here because things aren't working. And I want you to take that as a clue of like, okay, we had this hypothesis of ODD. Just because the doctor said that's what it was, it doesn't mean it's true. Now we've experimented with like how to treat ODD. It didn't work because things escalated. My child's not doing well. Now let's experiment with another approach or lens, which is the PDA lens. So with ADHD, this is something that often co-occurs with PDA, but the role that I play with your family is to isolate the PDA variable. What does that mean? That means we're going to do everything we can to support that root cause perception of the loss of autonomy or equality and how it activates their nervous system. And once we can get that to a point where it's not obscuring all the other things that could be going on, like trauma or temperament or, relationship stuff that we have to rework on, or ADHD or other things, we need to isolate that variable so we can see more clearly all the other ways that we can support our child. Like, for example, I'll give you 2 examples with my own son where, he is PDA, but he also had a lot of relationship trauma with me, right? So we isolate the PDA variable, but we also had to work on our relationship and do some trauma healing with him. And we did neurofeedback, we did the Safe and Sound protocol. And for 4 years, I've been doing intensive occupational therapy with him, both in the home, but out of the home, primarily as a way to reconceptualize and strengthen our relationship. And I needed to learn tools that were not verbal to get to a place of connection because, I didn't know how to communicate and connect with a child who wasn't highly verbal or interested in reading books, puzzles, doing activities. Like, that's just not my personality, right? Or the way that my brain works, right? I'm like, let's have a conversation about deep things and we're going to like get to know each other. But that's not how my son is. He's very body based. So it had to be through play and occupational therapy. Now that some of his trauma has been healed, our relationship is so much better. He's very accommodated. He's also on medication, has a service dog, and we basically just move between points of safety, right? Like, I don't take him anywhere that's not a affirming space, which is I'm actually going to talk about in module 5 in my current cohort for the paradigm shift program. But now that all that's in place, now I'm like, oh, it looks like he also has ADHD, right? But I couldn't see that until I'd isolated those other variables. And that's like really what the page is for, and what my role is, hopefully, to help you understand your child's brain better, to understand like, okay, we've got this, accommodation, we're working on this, but oh wait, they still have a ton of generalized anxiety, and maybe we can also support that, right? Because it's never black and white of just like PDA and nothing else. Because your kids have personalities and they have temperaments and they have, depending on their age, they'll have different traumatic experiences. Like my son's was with me because I was a really strict parent, and school was like his safe place where he could go crazy and be chaotic with other kids because he's extroverted. For other families, there's going to be more safety that always was happening at home, but there was potentially some trauma with school. So, we have to look at the nuances and isolate that one variable so we can see the picture clearly and move forward in a way that aligns with your particular child. Okay. So the last 2 questions I think are a little bit easier to answer than the one that I just answered, because that was a little more nuanced, and I never want to like get into the space of clinicians because that's not what I am. So the 5th question is, what if my child seems fine at school and really like okay and happy and compliant, but that they come home and explode or shut down, and it's like 2 different versions of the child? And this might be really hard to hear because, and this would really like freak me out too, and it's something I didn't understand in the beginning because my son is so social. So it was hard for me to discern, like, is he masking when he's with other kids and like internalizing his threat response? Or is he actually having a really good time and that's just who he is when he's regulated, right? But the patterns I did see clearly, and I see clearly often over and over again, are like when you have that dichotomy of two different versions of the child, and the child comes home and it's just like as soon as they perceive safety, there's this total change in their body and expression. That's masking, right? Where they can seem fine at school or with a grandparent, but then their brain in those situations is actually on a subconscious level perceiving like, I'm not safe to let the threat response out. I'm gonna, like, as a survival mechanism, totally internalize it and potentially imitate neurotypical norms on top of that, depending on the child. And then I'm going to come home, and the moment I perceive safety, it's going to be a different version of me. And that was like, when my son was still in public school, it was kind of incredible because we lived 3 blocks away from the school. We bought the house here in Michigan to be in a good school district next to the school where his cousins were going to go. And that crashed and burned, as you may relate to. But, you know, I would walk to pick him up and he would seem fine. He would be coming out of the school. He'd get on his bike. And the second, like, his face was not facing the school, the teachers, the other kids, it would, like, a mask would come off. It would drop. I would see the tension, and I would always have to have a pacifier in my pocket, and he would put it, they used to wear masks, so he would put it behind his mask to regulate and go, like, race home as fast as he possibly could. And it was, you know, I could see physically the mask coming off. And the first time I noticed this was actually like almost 4 years ago now, when he was starting to go into burnout. I would leave, you know, I had given my two months notice because I felt like the institution needed me for that long. I'm such a people pleaser. But I had started to take off vacation, and I didn't know what to do with him because he was like kind of like a feral animal or shut down. And so I would take him, this was in the summer, I would take him to a pool that we belonged to during the day. And so there wasn't really anyone there during the week because it's DC and everybody works. And I would just push him back and forth across the pool with my infant son's like little floaty that you can put your legs through, and it had shade, right? So he was like he was 3.5, almost 4. Was he? No, he was 4.5. I'm sorry. 4.5. And I would push him back and forth in silence. And there were like trees rustling around. And it was almost like he was like a baby. You know, he had a pacifier in, he was in this little floaty. I would push him back and forth, just hours like that in the pool. But sometimes later in the day, like friends from his daycare would come, and the second he would see them, he would take off like the floaty and like throw his pacifier at me. And it was like a change would come over his face. And it was just this like, what is happening? You know, I'd never heard of masking. I'd never thought that he was autistic, you know, all the things. And so that's really something to tune into. And as you get to know your child better, and as you start to accommodate them better, it will become more clear when they're masking versus when they're actually enjoying themselves. But it is, you know, it is something to be aware of. Okay, I have a question. Is masking similar to a fawn trauma response? Okay, so this is a question I get, and I think there can be overlap, but from my understanding of a fawn response, it's more like proactively attempting to ingratiate yourself with an authority figure for protection, right? So like a fawning child might in a classroom, you know, be the teacher's helper, go over and try and like really be seen, but in a particular role with the teacher, so that they're protected by the authority that actually activates them, versus a child who like is completely compliant and quiet and just puts their head down potentially, or like doesn't say anything. That's one more introverted expression that's a little different than fawning. But then you also have like my son, who masked by being very like outgoing and pretending to be more neurotypical, right? And he would just shove down the activation and then come home. And he wasn't fawning, like he was still a little naughty. Like I remember when he was in daycare, like the daycare when he was in his mid threes, late threes, they were like, Cooper really just gets all the kids to do